You know, it's really difficult to overestimate the importance of the Exodus event, not only in the life of the Israelites, but also in the life of the Christian. One of the challenges that we face when we look at that story is just how we have, just over the course of our lives or when we have examined it, sometimes reduced it to particular points along the way, or not seeing the full picture. Right, and one of the places we do that is at Mount Sinai when Moses goes up the mountain and receives the Ten Commandments from God. This incredible moment where God and his people enter into this covenant relationship that in some ways foreshadows the marriage of God and his people at the end of time. The extraordinary imagery and depth of relationship. And when we look at the event on Mount Sinai, oftentimes we're like, well, here's the Ten Commandments, this burdensome thing God gave us to follow. The reality is it's so much more than that. God giving his entire self to his people and asking for the people's lives in return. And, their giving of their lives was to be evidenced by their keeping of the commandments. And I just invite you this week to flip the script on your reading of the commandments and see it from a different perspective. Not just what God has commanded us to do, but what he regards as holy, right? So God himself is holy, right? He is the one true God, over and against all false gods, so we worship him and him alone, right? He is the Holy One. His name is holy, so we respect it. The Sabbath is holy, right? God rested on the seventh day, and so, calls and commands us to respect, of that day, to keep it holy, to sanctify it, if you will, through our rest and our worship. Parenthood is holy, life is holy, marriage is holy, property to a certain extent is holy, and the rights of other people. Words are holy, and our hearts are holy. The commandments against coveting, the goods and relationships of our neighbor. And in that too, God kind of points forward to the renewal of the heart that Jesus will bring about through his life and his spirit. Maybe that's a new reading of the commandments, but it's really what God and his spirit calls us to. And as we look to the gospel reading as well, there's a couple of points that are really just, extraordinary. What was happening there was, a legitimate exchange of currency and the selling of the selling of the animals that were required for sacrifice. So those things were good. They needed to happen. People would come from a long ways away, and sometimes wouldn't risk a blemish on their animal for sacrifice, so they would come purchase one in the temple. But being from all over, they didn't necessarily have the temple currency at hand, so they needed someone to exchange their money so that they could purchase the animal for sacrifice. So that role of the money changers and those selling animals wasn't itself wrong, but maybe where it was happening. Right? And this is fascinating. There was an outer court of the temple that the Gentiles could come to. Pagans who were God-fearers. They believed in God. And so they were able to come to the outer court of the temple to worship there. And that's probably where this money changing and animal selling was happening. What it was doing was preventing the other nations from coming to the temple to worship God as he was calling them to. God's people were getting in the way of God's work, drawing others into relationship with him. How common is that, unfortunately? Sometimes we get in the way of God's work, and, sometimes we don't even realize it. But that's what Jesus is so frustrated with, is ultimately the prevention of the Gentiles from coming to worship God in the temple. But the other major point from the gospel reading that I would mention is Jesus' claim to raise up the temple in 3 days if it's destroyed. And people are confused. They think the temple made of stone right there in front of them, but it's not about the temple made of stone. It's about the temple of his body. Jesus himself is the dwelling place of God on earth, and that's in his entire person, Jesus, his soul and body. And what Jesus is going to do is raise up his body in 3 days, the true temple of the Spirit on earth. And, It's just a reminder for us that as we look forward to our celebration of Easter, what are we celebrating? Well, the resurrection. The resurrection of what? It's not the resurrection of a soul. It's not the resurrection of a mind. It's the resurrection of the body. And a reminder for us that our whole person is our soul and body together. So there's a lot of points here, a lot of major points, but I would just draw your mind back through those few things. One, flip the script on your reading of the commandments and see that God is proclaiming what is holy and desires to protect it, and also help us to enter into those holy things and relationships that He's called us to. As well, recognizing that, sometimes we get in the way of God's work, and we really need to cooperate with Him and in welcoming, and drawing all people to relationship with Him. But as well, too, celebrating the resurrection. We celebrate the resurrection of the body, and some of us may not think that's such a good thing, Sometimes people like to escape their body, it's breaking down on earth, but God is going to restore you to, the best version of yourself, the best version of yourself that He always desired for you. What you're going to experience in your glorified body is well beyond, anything that you ever even did on earth. Even if you're the greatest of athletes, your glorified body is going to be better in eternity than what you could experience on earth. So we turn in all of those things in gratitude to the Lord for making Himself accessible to us, drawing us into relationship and allowing us to worship Him as we're called to. And certainly, we look forward in joy and hope to the celebration of the resurrection at Easter, but most especially the resurrection in the life.